Welcome everyone to this Vital Sites event hosted by IUCN and the World Commission on Protected Areas. Your Master of Ceremonies for this webinar and panel discussion will be Roger Crofts, to whom we will now hand over. Roger, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Good early evening for some of you, perhaps. Good afternoon from where I'm sitting in Scotland, and a very early morning, I think, in the Americas, if you're joining us from there. A warm welcome. We've been working on geo-heritage conservation within WCPA now for a number of years, and we've set up a specialist group, and the numbers of that are growing. And we thought that it was very important that we decided to set out some guidelines as part of the best practice guideline series. So we're number 31 in that series. It was issued formally at the end of November amongst our own small group. So this afternoon, I have with me some of my co-author colleagues, Dan Tormey, who has got to get up early this morning because he's based in California. John Gordon, who coincidentally lives not far from, a few miles from where I live in Scotland, and not in here live in person is Jose Brila from northern Portugal. Unfortunately, can't be with us because he's a working academic and has to do some PhD examining today. I'm just going to share my screen just now. I've been associated and a member of WCPA for 25 years now. I've been regional vice chair for Europe. And during that time, I've been extremely fortunate in being able to travel to all the continents and to many wonderful sites. I'm showing here my second home site because I go to Iceland at least every year, and I've been there about 30 times, and I'm just showing off my Icelandic jersey in that picture there. I've chosen this picture though because it's Iceland's newest protected area, and it was threatened with exploitation for the geothermal energy. You can see that it is one of these peculiar sites that has both active volcanic activity, but also some small glaciers as well. And it took a long time and a lot of argument to get this protected as a nature reserve, but also as a landscape protected area. It's very interesting looking at the geology, but if you're an ordinary punter, if you like, what is really nice is to see these amazing colors, because there's a particular type of rock here called rhyolite, and you get, as you can see in the photograph, all of the different colors from the weathering of that rock in this Arctic environment. We've been working in what's called the Geo-heritage Specialist Group of WCPA, established about 5 or 6 years ago. It's chaired by a splendid colleague of ours from the Republic of Korea, Kung-Sik Woo, who is a cave specialist. And we have a wide range of expertise, some geologists, some geomorphologists, and then other people like me who many years ago did train in these subjects, but now are more interested, not so much in the science, but in communicating the information to our colleagues. Some people often ask the question, well, why do we need to bother about geoconservation? We know how essential it is that we improve our performance globally on biodiversity conservation. I mean, that was made extremely clear, wasn't it? Almost a couple of years ago now in the IPB's reports and the demands for transformational approaches. And we know that from the work that IUCN has done recently in tracking the performance against the AHE targets, for instance, target 11, which we are particularly interested in protected areas, but the others. So it is vital. And there's also a view that, well, these geological, geomorphological features and processes are terribly robust, and they'll look after themselves. We don't need to really bother about them. Well, I can tell you that if you go to this island, San Bartolome, in the Galapagos archipelago, a marine national park in Ecuador, that even with highly controlled tourism, these landforms are extremely fragile, and people want to go and sit in the lava tubes as if they're driving a Formula One racing car or something. And so it's not that they are robust, they're not always. So we regard geoconservation as essential. This really started off in the early part of this millennium with debates about a revision of the guidelines on protected area management categories, which I'm sure, or I hope all listeners are familiar with anyway. And we looked again at the definition of protected areas. And some of us were very keen that we used the word nature in that definition, that it wasn't just about biodiversity, it was the whole of the natural system. And you'll hear more about expanding that definition and what the different components are from Jose Brilla, who will speak next. So that triggers us into basically the establishment of this specialist group, and also the requirement to develop some guidelines. Also, many of these features and processes are quite fragile, as I've already hinted, and are non-renewable. If we dig up soil profiles, it will take a long time for them to reform. If we take away major mineralogical or fossil finds, you might lock them in a museum, but it's much better to see them in situ, because you can see the context of them. A lot of recent work has also been done in describing geoconservation as an intrinsic component of the whole ecosystem approach. IUCN has done a lot of work on the ecosystem approach over the decades, particularly through CEM. And it's very important that we capture what we might call the abiotic elements of nature within that. And of course, we also need to think about the implications of climate change. And John Gordon in particular in his presentation will talk about that. And finally, and this is something that I really want to stress, you know, often earth scientists, geologists, geomorphologists and the like talk in language that I can't understand. They're really fond of polysyllabic words in huge long sentences, whereas we have challenged ourselves in writing this guideline to speak a common language of conservation so that others can understand it. And that's why our target audience are protected area managers and staff, biodiversity specialists and other specialist advisors who work in individual protected areas or work within the system as a whole. You can access the guidelines from the IUCN website quite easily. Please use the DOI version, because then we can track how many people are downloading it. And it's absolutely up to date. It's very easy. There aren't any hard copies. It's purely in electronic form, because that's the way to distribute things these days. I want to acknowledge at this point the tremendous help and assistance from the Cultural Heritage Administration of the Republic of Korea, who provided basic funding to help us to produce this volume, and also hopefully to produce versions in other languages. It's only in English at the moment. We will be working definitely on versions in French and Spanish, the other two IUCN languages, also in Portuguese, and I'm promised versions also in Arabic, Chinese, and German. So any of you who are listening who are well versed in those languages, well, just get in touch and I can direct you to those people who are working on it. We had a team of people working on this. They're the key authors that are listed there, but we had many other people making inputs, writing case studies and all the rest of it. So very much a collective effort. We deliberately wanted to make this useful to everyone. So we set out a whole series of best practice guidelines, what we think is good practice, common sense, but useful to everybody. We also have lots of figures, boxes, tables. It's a very photogenic subject, this, so there are lots of photos. Virtually all the 200 references have a web link, and we do have a glossary, and I'm working at the moment with IUCN staff to migrate that glossary into the standard IUCN glossary of terms. We dedicated our guideline to Dr. Graham Warboys, who was one of our co-authors and a very close friend and colleague, who died during the process of this. Many of you will, I'm sure, have come across Graham, his wonderful work as the boss of the Kosciuszko National Park in New South Wales, Australia, for his work on connectivity, and he's masterminding that amazing volume on protected area management a few years ago. A truly inspiring colleague, leader on geoconservation and a campaigning conservation, as we say there. I'm not going to take you through the report, you'll be relieved to know. I just set out on this slide here the list of contents on the left-hand side, and a diagram of the three main elements of the report. What the authors want to do is for people to look at, obviously, the first chapter, which is quite short, but particularly to look at sections 2 and 3, where we define the context and the definitions and set out some general principles. You may think, well, that's not very relevant for us as managers or workers in protected areas, but without that context, we don't think you will get such a good understanding. Then you can cherry pick, if you like, in relation to what you're looking for. So the next section is all about establishing geo-heritage protected areas, either on their own or adding to existing protected area systems, which are there for other reasons, particularly biodiversity or maybe cultural heritage regions, for example. And then much of the rest of the guideline is about management, how you establish management systems, how it relates to the protected area management categories, how you deal with threats. And last but no means least, the importance of education and communication. And Dan Tormey will talk about that more later. I want to just do two more things in this introduction. First, I want to introduce you to what we call the key values of geoconservation. And the reason I'm doing this, I think these are important to everyone, whether in any aspect of conservation, and I hope they ring bells. I've just given a photographic example for each one. So the first one is, it's important because it's there, what we call in posh language intrinsic. You know, the older I get, the more important I think is that we recognize that nature is so fundamental to us all as individuals and as society. We should recognize that we need to look after nature and the intrinsic values it gives us. It's important for science and for education. And given the example here of the Burgess Shales in the Yoho National Park in the Canadian Rockies, because this has been a site where scientists over generations have basically described what we call the Cambrian explosion of life. and discovering animals which we didn't think existed through detailed analysis, and then new generations coming along. And then educating the public. This is one of the interpretation stuff at Parks Canada there, for example. And there are lots of sites like this around the world that are very important for both giving the option of new minds from new generations to dig and delve and come up with new explanations, but also essentially to make sure that we reach out that knowledge and information to everybody who is interested. There are many protected areas which have spiritual and cultural associations. There's now a new best practice guideline published earlier this year on the spiritual and cultural, and I suggest you look at that. But there is a real linkage between natural geoheritage sites like this cave in the Royal Natal National Park in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and art forms from many generations ago. And there is an obvious value in terms of what we might call the substrate, what's underneath, the type of soil, its chemical makeup, the temperature, the topography, and the influence it has on the vegetation, but especially, and this is a good example here in the Tongariro National Park in New Zealand. And finally, the importance of the value of environmental goods and services, what we might call the abiotic ecosystem services, which contribute and link to all the other services that you'll be familiar with from the Millennium Ecosystem approach and everything that followed from that: natural regulating services, supporting, provisioning, cultural, and we think knowledge services is very important in this one as well. So that's the sort of material that's in the early part of this guideline to set the scene and give you examples of these. I've just shown you some examples here, like this one in the Vanuatu National Park. One of the issues that I found as someone who set up and ran the Nature and Natural Heritage Agency in Scotland, Scottish Natural Heritage, was bringing together the geodiversity and the biodiversity elements in the work we did, particularly in protected areas. And that stimulated myself and my old colleague, John Gordon, to explore this more. And we've got some part of the guidelines where we're teasing out the areas of synergy, if you like, and the areas of potential conflict and how we deal with those. I'm just showing on the right there a poster that we produced, I think way back for the last World Pots Congress in Sydney some years ago, where we talk about conserving the stage. It's this concept that biodiversity doesn't happen in a bubble, it actually happens on the ground, and that the species of plants and animals are dependent on and interrelated with what is happening above them and below them, at the side of them, the flows of nutrients, of minerals, the types of soil and the like. And we've explored this a little in the volume. Here's an example done by our colleague Maria Garcia from Brazil, looking at the goods and services provided by geodiversity in the coastal region of Sao Paulo state. So looking at the different ecosystems and what under the 5 services that we talk about in the Millennium Ecosystem approach will be provided by those, by geodiversity. So it's just trying to tease that out in more detail. Or at a more simple level, recognizing the interdependency between the biotic and the abiotic, the bio and the geo elements of of conservation and their interdependency, and examples there, quite simple ones, but I think they're quite important to get over the message of that interaction. So if you go to the giant prismatic spring in Yellowstone National Park, you'll see how the specialist plants do reflect the chemistry of the rocks and the water. Or if you go to the bottom one there, if you go to the Shamari Reserve in Jordan to the east of Amman, you'll see ecosystems totally dependent on adequate supply of water and nutrients. So what do we think about? How do we manage this situation? What is, I mean, there are clearly times when there are conflicts. You will say, the geoconservation people might say, well, we can't see the rock outcrops now, or we can't see the landforms because they've been covered by vegetation. And yet maybe a priority management objective in that protected area is to regenerate the natural vegetation. So trying to tease out, is there a conflict? How can you resolve that? Can it be resolved with a double win? With a win for biodiversity conservation and for geoconservation. Hopefully that can be the case. If not, is one set of values, biodiversity or geodiversity, much more fundamental? Is there a possibility that, for instance, in the example of vegetation growing and masking a site of geoheritage significance, well, could that be allowed, but periodically to allow new scientists to come along and look at that, to remove some of the vegetation and then let it come back? Or is the resolution only available beyond the protected area or within, say, a wider bioregion? There aren't answers to that in the generality. These are just a series, if you like, checklist questions that I hope can be addressed. And our best practice guideline, therefore, number 19 in this case, is to recognize both positive and negative interrelationships between biodiversity and geodiversity conservation to provide the best possible outcome for nature conservation. So that concludes my short presentation. I'd be very happy. I don't know whether there are any particular questions on that at the moment. I see there's a question, how can we join the specialist group? The answer is quite clear. You can, if you go onto the WCPA website and click on to the Geo-heritage specialist group, part of that website, you'll see how to do that. And the Secretary General, Wesley Hill, and I see she's there. Wesley, do you want to answer that question just now? Well, I don't see any other questions at this moment. So what I'd like to do is to ask Ruchia to put on the next presentation from Professor Jose Brilla, who will talk about some of the general principles.
Hello, I am going to talk about geodiversity, geoheritage, and geoconservation, especially addressed to nature conservation. So let's start with the definition of geodiversity. Geodiversity is a term already with 30 years old, but it is still not very well known by the general society. It is composed by the diversity of non-living elements of nature, such as minerals, rocks, fossils, landforms and landscapes, soils, and active geological and geomorphological processes like volcanism, like coastal erosion, like mass movements. So there are several active processes that are affecting us in a regular basis, and they are also part of geodiversity. I am not going to enter into detail with this maybe complicated diagram, But I want to stress that geodiversity is the parallel term comparing with biodiversity, and that geodiversity underpins biodiversity. Of course, as I already said, geodiversity is composed by several elements that we have on the left side, and we can characterize geodiversity either in a quantitative way and a qualitative way. We can define and calculate geodiversity indexes, and we can map those geodiversity indexes in order to evaluate and in order to characterize a certain area. And of course, we can describe the different geodiversity elements that exist in a certain area also. But here I would like to stress that geodiversity contributes to the natural capital. I know that when we read the definition of natural capital, we know that geodiversity elements are included in definition. However, when we see the conventions, the programs, the initiatives related with natural capital, we don't see them. So natural capital usually are just referred to biological elements and forget the geological elements. But in truth, natural capital, of course, provides benefits, and geodiversity also provides these benefits that are generally known by ecosystem services. And these ecosystem services, of course, are based in different values, like we have here on the left side: scientific value, educational, economical, cultural, aesthetic values that different geodiversity elements can provide. And different ecosystem services, as we know, the provisioning ecosystem services, cultural, regulating, supporting, all these ecosystem services, geodiversity can play a very important role that usually, again, is forgotten. We don't see the importance of geodiversity elements when we read the national and international conventions, programs, strategies, initiatives regarding ecosystem services. Usually, geodiversity is not mentioned at all. But here, and just very briefly to finish this part of the diagram, we cannot forget that we depend on geodiversity for our way of life, for our resources, in fact, for everything. We are completely dependent on the geological resources, and not only the resources that we usually consider as extractable geological resources, but also the non-extractable natural resources. And these ones is what I am going to explain just after this. So we have geodiversity as the central topic, and from this topic of geodiversity, we reach the definition of geoheritage. So what is geoheritage? Because they are not synonymous. Geodiversity is the whole variety of non-living elements in nature, but geoheritage is just one part of geodiversity. Geoheritage is composed by certain minerals, rocks, fossils, soils, landforms, and geological active processes with exceptional value. And this is very important to say that when we talk about geoheritage, we are talking in specific elements with a particular value. And we can have two types of geoheritage. We can have what we call the in situ geoheritage, which it is composed by geosites, by precise locations where we have these elements in their natural location, where they appear naturally. And we have also the ex situ geoheritage, which is composed by essentially by the geological collections that we have in museums, in universities, in institutes, where we have these elements that are not longer in the original place of occurrence, but they still maintain their scientific and educational value and sometimes cultural value. So why do we need geoconservation? And here we have to say that geoconservation is the conservation of geoheritage, not all geodiversity, because we cannot protect and conserve all geodiversity because we need to consume geodiversity every day. And so that's why we cannot achieve to conserve all geodiversity, but we need to achieve the conservation of geoheritage, of those elements that are really important. And it is important to underline that geoheritage needs to be conserved and protected because it's a natural resource and it's a non-renewable natural resource. And for instance, many fossils of extinct species, once they disappear or they are lost or destroyed, they are forever. We cannot recover those fossils because the animals that originate those fossils are extinct. So it's a non-renewable natural resource and with different types of values. We have the scientific value, the educational value, cultural value, the same values that we mentioned before for geodiversity. We can consider these different values also for geoheritage. And we can give them several types of uses. And when we talk here about the use of geoheritage, of course, we are talking about the sustainable use of geoheritage. So we are not mention the destruction of geological resources, of course. We are talking about the conservation of those places that need to be preserved. And these places, and perhaps this is a surprise for many people, but many of these geodiversity elements are affected by threats. What kind of threats? Well, mainly are man-made threats. And we can refer here several examples of these threats. So what are the main aims of a geoconservation strategy? And we can implement geoconservation strategies at different levels, at the national level, at the regional level, and even at the local level, or a geoconservation strategy, for instance, for a national park. It's possible to implement these strategies at different levels. So the main aims of a geoconservation strategy are several, and we can start to mention science. We need to protect the best possible geosites to allow present and future study and research of Earth's history. But also, we need to improve education. As I said before, many people do not recognize the importance of geodiversity and geoheritage. And so we need to promote formal and informal education of geosciences to raise society awareness of geodiversity. Also, for planning, it is very important, a geoconservation strategy, because we need to give managers and policymakers new information and tools to include in nature conservation strategies and in land use planning. And finally, we also have a contribution for sustainable tourism. When we have a well-managed site for tourism, it means that we can promote the development of an alternative tourism offer, in particular in less developed regions, raising the income of local communities. And of course, this is very relevant. So how to do geoconservation? How to implement a geoconservation strategy? Well, there are several steps in this strategy, and the first step is inventorying. And there are several methods to make the inventory of geoheritage that, of course, I am not going to enter into detail here, but in the literature, we can find several types of methods adapt to different types of scale because it's easy to understand that one thing is to make the inventory of the whole country, and another thing is to make the inventory of a small protected area. So the methods are different. We need to, of course, to characterize and assess geoheritage. And today there are also methods in order to do the quantitative assessment of the values and of the risk of degradation of geosites. we need to have a good legislation that allow the protection of geoheritage, and this is also a step, of course, in the whole process. And we need to implement conservation strategies. We need to define what are the threats, how these threats can be eradicated, how we can improve the visiting conditions, how we can, and this is also important, how we can promote the site and present a correct interpretation. It's very common to visit a protected area in many countries, and we don't find information about what is the geodiversity of that area or what is the geoheritage in that area. We just have information about biodiversity. And again, this is something that we need to change little by little, but we need to change and to improve the communication about geoheritage for the general public. And finally, very important is to do the monitoring of geoheritage. And this is a crucial step in a strategy. And unfortunately, many times we don't do monitoring. And of course, it leads to the destruction of sites many times. So thank you very much for your attention. And I just would like to call your attention to a very new resolution, IUCN resolution 74, that was approved a couple of weeks ago, especially concerning geoheritage and protected areas. Thank you very much.
Jose, sorry you can't be with us, but unlike me, some of you have to work for a living. And that resolution that's just been approved is really part of a long journey we've been having in IUCN since 2008, really, at each successive Congress from Barcelona onwards. We've had resolutions recognizing the importance of geodiversity, geoheritage conservation as part of IUCN's activities, and this further consolidates it. And one of the particular issues that we're working on is the possibility of key geoheritage areas as a complement to the key biodiversity areas program, which was established a long time ago. Now, I'm just looking to see if there are any particular questions for Jose. I don't see any, in which case I'm going to ask John Gordon to talk to us. He will give his talk pre-recorded, but he is with us so he can address any questions afterwards. So if you could switch on his presentation, that would be great, Ruchir.
Hello everyone. This presentation is on dealing with threats to geoheritage in protected and conserved areas. I want to focus in particular on climate change and the threats arising from climate change. In terms of the outline of the presentation, I'll provide a little bit of context, looking at threats generally, then examining the issue of sensitivity of geoheritage sites and features. Then I'll look at impacts, and then dealing with impacts specifically of climate change. This is potentially a large field, but the best practice guidelines on geoconservation provide a good outline of the issues and the details and some of the solutions. So I would strongly refer you to the guidelines for additional information. So let's start with the principal threats to geoheritage sites and features. And I'm looking here at the broad context of all threats, not just climate change. These are listed on this slide, and it's often thought that geoheritage sites, protected areas are robust, but that isn't necessarily the case, and geoheritage interests are vulnerable to a wide range of pressures and threats. Some of these are obvious and are illustrated here. There are threats from urban and infrastructure development, threats from mining and mineral extraction. This is a sand and gravel quarry. Changes in land use, afforestation can obscure geomorphological features. River and coastal management can have quite a big impact on geoheritage interests, where these involve heavily engineered solutions. And climate change and sea level rise are becoming new and increasingly issues of concern for their impacts on coastal sites such as this sand dune system here. An important consideration in thinking about the impacts of these various pressures and threats on geoheritage sites and features is that of sensitivity. Some activities may cause severe damage to sensitive sites, but may have little impact on more robust sites. For example, on the left, this is a recent volcanic crater in Iceland comprising relatively fragile lavas. It has a high visitor pressure from geotourists, and a boardwalk has been created to stop significant erosion. Whereas a much more robust Paleogene suite of lavas and caves on the west coast of Scotland is a much more robust site and less sensitive to visitor impacts. And another consideration is that some active systems may be capable of self-repairing. For example, a sand dune system that's been impacted by heavy recreational pressure may be able to self-heal by or through appropriate low-tech restoration measures. Whereas a relict glacial landform formed by Pleistocene ice sheets, if damaged or destroyed, simply cannot reform because the processes that created it are no longer in operation. The principal impacts arising from that varied range of threats can be summarised as follows. The last slide shows physical impacts arising from sand and gravel quarrying in a relict glacial landform. Loss of visibility or access to exposures may arise from landfill or through encroaching vegetation. Damage to site integrity may occur through fragmentation of interest. This is a relict glacial landform and esker system before sand and gravel quarrying, which has now punched a large gap through the site, fragmenting the landforms. Human impacts and pressures can also cause disruption of natural processes. Installation of heavily engineered coast protection works interrupts sediment movement along the coast, often leading to enhanced erosion between the area that's protected. This can also lead to loss of aesthetic value and degradation of other ecosystem services, such as loss of habitats, loss of geotourism potential. So that's a summary of some of the principal impacts from the various threats and pressures. In terms of dealing with threats, the general principles and generic guidance are summarised in the guidelines, and there are numerous examples in the document. More detailed guidance on conservation techniques and specific case studies are included in this publication by Colin Prosser and others in 2006, and the reference to this publication is contained in the guidelines. So that's a little bit of background and context. Let's turn now to dealing with threats from climate change. And broadly, I think there are two sets of impacts arising from climate change, and these arise from more dynamic landscapes. For example, an example of a retreating glacier margin, the slopes and landscapes here are becoming much more active and dynamic as a consequence of glacier retreat. Slopes are becoming more unstable. There's a risk of the drainage of ice-dammed lakes. And at the coast also, we may see more active landslips as a consequence of increased rainfall, increased pore water pressures in soft sedimentary rocks. And a second set of impacts arises from human responses to climate change. So let's look at the impacts from more dynamic landscapes. These may result in accelerated weathering of rocks and sediments, increased erosion, and increased vegetation growth on exposures, requiring increased frequency of interventions. There may be loss of features through enhanced erosion. This black horizon at the base of this sequence of sediments here is an interglacial peat bed. It occurs on the coast, and rising sea level is likely to lead to the destruction of this site through increased erosion. It's a very limited exposure. Increasing sea level may also lead to loss of intertidal exposures at the coast. But new exposures might also be created through increased erosion and by landslips. So there may be some benefits as well in more dynamic landscapes. Impacts from human responses may lead to sealing of exposures by increased requirement for hard coast defences, river defences, particularly where infrastructure and other human activities are vulnerable. And these increased coast defence measures and riverbank protection measures may lead to loss of exposures. And the types of sites that are most likely to be at risk are coastal, river and mountain sites, sites with quaternary sediment exposures, soft sediment exposures. Glacial and periglacial features may also be vulnerable to increased geomorphological process activity, and sites with finite or very restricted rock or sediment exposures will also be vulnerable. In dealing with these threats from climate change, there are a number of possible management options. In the case of large active geomorphological sites, the simplest option and the cheapest option is simply to do nothing and allow the geomorphological processes to adapt naturally. For example, in the case of this large coastal sand dune beach, raised beach system, it would be totally impractical and simply not cost effective to attempt to try and stabilize this sort of landform system. And the only realistic option is to allow the system to evolve naturally. A second set of options for active geomorphological sites is to adopt natural solutions and to work with nature and to try to manage the likely consequences of change. And this may mean creating space for natural processes. For example, it may mean removing flood banks along river managements, allowing rivers to flood across their floodplains. This, in effect, would have the advantages also of providing temporary flood storage as a natural form of flood mitigation. And it would also have benefits in terms of enabling the development of floodplain wetland habitats and enhancing biodiversity. So it may be appropriate to, rather than thinking about attempting to fix and control active systems, to have flexible site boundaries that can be adapted as active process systems develop and evolve naturally. If intervention is considered essential, then the first option should be soft forms of coast defence, for example, using windbreaks and planting of vegetation to help the stabilisation of sand dune systems. In the case of geological sites, more proactive management might include regular vegetation clearance where that's appropriate, or exceptionally it might include the burial of sites to protect highly vulnerable finite interests, but obviously this would only be a short-term solution. In some cases it may be appropriate to excavate replacement sites if that is feasible, and if similar rock sequences or sediment sequences can be exposed in areas that are less vulnerable to active erosion. And if all else fails, then a last resort may simply be to undertake recording and research for posterity. It may be necessary simply to rescue rare fossils, excavate fossil horizons, and curation of the fossils properly in museum collections, and to archive sediment logs and photographic records. So this may be a form of last resort adaptation. So to draw some conclusions about the management of geoheritage sites in the face of climate change and other pressures, geoheritage is clearly vulnerable to a range of pressures and threats, and we should remember that these may have incremental and cumulative impacts. It's not just necessarily a single threat that is of concern. Climate change working or may have cumulative impacts on other pressures. For example, may exacerbate recreational pressures. It may have indirect as well as direct impacts, which may exacerbate other impacts. As far as possible, we should think about trying to work with natural processes and using nature-based solutions as the first option. And finally, we need to recognise and integrate geoconservation in spatial planning strategies and policies, and to communicate that with planning authorities. So I'll conclude there, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for that presentation. John is actually with us in real life, and I saw a question come up from Annette Petterson. Thank you for that. Would you like to hear thoughts on how to balance between a static management of nature, keeping the status quo, and the dynamic nature-free geological processes, for instance, when we talk about threats to geoheritage and coastal erosion? John, I'd like you to comment on that, but I'll just make a comment first off on that point. I would say it really depends on the conservation priorities of the protected area at the site level. And I'll give you an example. I mean, John showed a photograph of a place called a National Nature Reserve on the east coast of Scotland called the Sands of St. Cyrus, where I was fortunate to do my first ever coastal geomorphology research. And there was a really interesting debate because the interaction of a river mouth and stormy seas meant that one of the habitats in the area was very vulnerable and often got buried. And that was the salt marsh. But the sand dunes, the salt marsh and the cliffs were regarded as the key three habitats in the area because the site had been decided on the basis of habitats rather than on current dynamic processes. And we had to have a debate, well, can you really safeguard that particular area? And the answer was no, because you couldn't afford to do it because it would have meant such a level of not just of cost, but of intrusion in a natural system that it meant that it wasn't worth it. But one will find these dilemmas all of the time and increasingly so, as John said. John, do you want to add anything?
Yes, I think that trying to preserve the status quo in many of these active sites is probably impractical. And I think we need to accept that the change is going to occur and to plan ahead and adapt to that change. Trying to fix and control active systems through heavily engineered solutions simply isn't either practical or cost effective unless there are valuable infrastructure or other developments, for example, at the coast. In those cases, it may be necessary to implement more engineered solutions, but letting natural processes operate is a way of offering natural solutions. Maintaining sediment supply to beaches and to salt marshes is a way of protecting the coast. Yes, there will be a degree of rollback, but in those active systems, this is probably the only realistic approach.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the question. I hope that's helpful. If you want to come back, use the Q&A box and we can take that up. I'd now like to invite our good friend and colleague from California, Dan Tormey, who is our expert on education and communication to give us his presentation. Over to you, Dan.
Okay, thank you, Roger. And yeah, feel very fortunate to be having worked with such a great group in putting this best practice guide together, and I'm very happy to share with the broader community some of our findings in small scale, hopefully to draw you to look at and use and share the best practice guides that we provided. I'm going to be talking about communicating geoheritage, and this picture shows Mount St. Helens, the site of a big 1980 eruption, big sector collapse, and restoration occurring afterwards. And this is the visitor center. This is the place where much of the communication surrounding this protected area occurs. And you can see that site was selected to bring the viewer, the person being educated, the public, directly into the scene. So this, my talk today, I wanted to go with the theme of communication in areas of geoheritage importance is a mechanism by which we can build a conservation ethic in society, starting with people who are just curious about the site. And I've got this quote from Freeman Tilden. He's a person who was working with the US National Park Service to develop interpretive programs. And he thought of building this ethic as through interpretation, understanding, through understanding, appreciation, and through appreciation, protection. And this really gives the progression towards building this conservation ethic. This photo is one of my favorite sites. It's in one of the most densely populated parts of Los Angeles, downtown, and yet it's a bit of ice age terrain that has been protected and preserved through the years. And in terms of helping people not just enjoy being outside, but understand and appreciate, and perhaps in wanting to protect what's out there, it's a fabulous place. So in the talk that I'm going to give you today, I'm going to look at each of those elements. First, interpretation, that bringing in the visitor to that initial um, understanding. And then education, people who are ready to go deeper. What are some approaches there to build appreciation? And then public outreach, which is kind of the hard work of conservation, but it's essential for protection. And it takes the dedication that is built through good communication of interpretation and education. And then I'll conclude with just a few of the new approaches that are available to us and that we've provided more detail on, and a lot of links to other sources within the best practice guide. So let's start with the interpretation. It's a communication process that establishes connections between a visitor and the geoheritage resources at the area that they are visiting. It's very much storytelling, aiming to build a connection between the visitor and the tangible elements before them. It's done in its best cases by actually placing the visitor in the scene so that they can directly experience and understand the space that they are within. And in the world of geology and geoheritage, I find this particularly exciting because it's time travel. You know, that previous picture in downtown LA, none of us have been to Ice Age Los Angeles, but that group I was with really felt they were there. And in this picture, I like this quote so much. It's from a World Heritage Site, the Joggins Fossil Cliffs in Canada. And Charles Lyell was one of the founders of geology. And in 1842, he visited this spot. And this quote says, "I went to see a forest of fossil coal trees, the most wonderful phenomena perhaps that I have seen." And he was reacting to outcrops like this cliff. And you can see here some carbonized layers. These are fossil trees from about 350 million years ago. And Charles Lyell was clearly in a forest. He was not standing in front of a rock outcrop, even though physically he was. Interpretation allowed him to time travel back to be within that forest. Here's a couple of other examples of good interpretation. If you saw our opening talk, you'll recognize our friend Roger Crofts there on the right. And this is the Knocken Crag National Reserve in Scotland. It's a thrust fault that's placing those older gray rocks on top of the younger tan rocks. And this particular interpretive area encourages you to place your hands on these, and by so doing, you can feel across the 500 million year gap that's represented by those two rock outcrops. On the right, this is another example of good interpretation from a national lake shore in the United States. And the rock outcrop has a lot of fossil plants from a little less than 500 million years ago. And the ranger doing their interpretive program is using a visual aid to bring the visitor back in that time so that they can really experience it directly and thereby understand the geoheritage that this protected area was set aside for. Okay, I'm going to turn to the next element of communication that brings people from the understanding to an appreciation, and that's education. And I've selected a particular example here that I've a program called the Envirothon. It's a high school educational program. I've worked with them for about 15 years, and I'm currently engaged in bringing it to China. I saw some of my colleagues in this effort on the talk today. Welcome. I'm glad you could make it. And the Envirothon, as it's educational component, it includes class work. Typically, it's an after-school program lasting about an hour or two. And that's the class component with materials brought from the field into the class. And then there's field experience as well. It's very much an intensely place-based learning approach. Towards the end of the year, there's local, regional, and national and international competitions now. Then these outdoor competitions are held in areas of high geoheritage value. So both that initial understanding when the kids first get here, as well as the appreciation as they conduct field data research, data collection, apply that to decision making, builds this appreciation for natural resource management. And 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 keeping with my theme here, the goal of the Envirothon as an educational tool is to build this conservation ethic, this desire to protect geoheritage, as well as encourage sustainable use of natural resources to the extent possible. Um, and this program, this educational program, began in the United States in the 1970s. It expanded to Canada shortly thereafter. And as I mentioned, we're working to bring it to China, where there's a great deal of interest in this type of education and some really just astounding geoheritage. So it's a beautiful combination for this program. Public outreach is the third type of communication that we directly address in the guidelines. And public outreach's goal is to provide input to stakeholders, people who are interested in the outcome of decisions, to provide input to them. And when done well, it helps gain support for conservation goals, for conservation and protected area management plans, and if we're fortunate, it builds support for expansion of protected areas. I've used this photo of Yuntaishan Global Geopark in China. This walkway is on a maybe 100 to 200 meter high vertical cliff. And this is the sort of thing that might take public outreach to construct in the first place. But actually, I put it here because for many park managers, this is what public outreach feels like. You know, you're right over this cliff and a lot is riding on how well you do this. And so the best practice guide seeks to give some examples to help diffuse some of that stress that public outreach can build. Um, the process is to identify the stakeholders. It might be local communities. It could be a global community if the area is of outstanding universal value. Tourist businesses, government, non-government organizations, all of these are examples of stakeholders who can productively be brought into the decision-making process through effective public outreach. Public outreach tailors the communication to the stakeholder group. If you have research stakeholders, as you frequently do, you know, maybe the best communication is a seminar such as what we're doing today. If it's the public, it would be communication tools more geared towards interpretation. So you do need to tailor the communication to the group so that they can understand the decision in front of them and be effective contributors to the decision making. And that is the goal, to foster informed dialogue and informed decision making. This is one example. A lot of times restrictions to access, in particular protected areas, is a requirement of public outreach. Geoheritage sites have a lot of very active and sometimes destructive phenomena that occur, earthquakes, eruptions, sometimes tsunami. Um, and so access restrictions are necessary and frequently framed in terms of safety and what you can't do. But using good communication tools in this outreach, you can transform that potential negative aspect of a restriction to an educational opportunity. You know, it's an opportunity to reach out to your stakeholders about the natural ongoing processes that were part of the reason this was a protected area in the first place. And it's an opportunity to use communication tools to deliver updated facts as the phenomena progresses. And using visual media is typically the most effective in this. The picture I've chosen here to exemplify this is from the volcanic island of Hawaii. This is the broad feature is Kilauea caldera, and the eye-catching lava lake there is Halemaumau crater. This area had a massive eruption in 2018, one of the largest in the last 50 years or so. And on this photo to the right, there used to be a visitor center. It's got some lava over it right now. It was completely destroyed. And of course, there were access restrictions, but looking to planning facilities in the future, the National Park Service is considering moving the volcano observatory to well away, about 40 kilometers away. And so that would have significant impact on research. You know, conceivably, we would know more about Mars than we would know about the evolving landscape of Halemaumau crater. So this is an area, these moves are active now, and it's a major area of public outreach that's challenging us right now. Now I want to turn to some of the tools that are available to us. And this is a place where it's just fun. You know, the communication of geoheritage has always been fun. It's what brought many of us into this as our life's work. And many of us enjoy telling the stories of geology and helping people experience the time travel that is part of this. But now there's an explosion of new information management and information dissemination tools. This is a picture from Outside magazine where you can hike the Appalachian Trail in the eastern United States on your app, you know, on your phone. And ideally, you would go outside and walk it, but people can't always do that. And this is a way to experience it in a virtual way. These digital tools are really driving a lot of new approaches. We're in an area of great invention, and you know, some things will sort out as we move along. Some approaches are going to work, some are not going to be as effective. But we're at a time now where it's like that Cambrian explosion of life that Roger mentioned earlier. There's all sorts of new ideas coming to the fore. And I think one of the long-term effects is going to be the protected areas now have the potential to directly interact with a worldwide base of visitors, not just those who come to the physical protected area itself for that experience of understanding and appreciation, but they can also partake of it virtually. And now some of the national park services, I know Parks Canada is embracing this extremely. It's that it's now viewing a visit as not just showing up at the park boundary. A visit begins with planning, using these tools to sort of test out areas, see where you would like to go when you visit, what is available to you, doing all that well beforehand, beginning the experience at home. And then the peak experience of actually visiting, breathing the air and time traveling. And then sharing this on social media is a big part of the visit. And then afterwards, being able to remember. One of the outcomes of the COVID-19 response is that many protected areas and our National Park Service in the United States, for example, has been using this period as a time to greatly enhance the content that they have both in their apps on phones. Grand Canyon has a great app. Yeah, many protected areas have fantastic apps with ranger-led tours. And now much of this is available online as well and can be used for education, home education. It's a tool for both teachers, parents, and students. And this one I just happened upon last week. I was in the waiting room of my doctor's office, and instead of playing a game on my phone, I took a ranger-led walking tour of the Bright Angel Trail with Ranger Dave. And it's now, you know, when when you walk around with your phone, you have your playlist of music that you like, but now you can carry apps of your favorite protected area and experience that for a few minutes during the course of a day. It's really a great time. So in conclusion, communicating geoheritage has these components that I've discussed, and there's really a continuum. I've chosen to have bins of interpretation, education, and public outreach, but all of those rely on the same set of facts of your protected area. What is there? What do we know about it? What do we not know about it? How do we manage it? Those facts are the same, but then you deliver that message through communication using different tools that are keyed to your audience. That's one of the themes of both the best practice guide as well as this talk. And again, just to remind us of the goal, these progressive steps are to build a conservation ethic within society by starting off with the youngest visitors and carrying through communicating with them, hopefully their entire life. And I'll just repeat, I love this quote so much, that the progression is through interpretation, understanding, through understanding, appreciation, and through appreciation, protection. And I will leave this with a picture that my friend Roger Crofts took at Yoho National Park at the Burgess Shale. He mentioned the Cambrian explosion, and this was a fabulous set of panels that really help you understand it right there among the scent of the pine trees and the view of the outcrop. So thank you. Thank you for joining us. Enjoy the best practice guides. We certainly did enjoy putting them together for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dan. It's interesting listening to colleagues talking. You learn so much from working with others. You think you know everything at my advanced age, but of course, you don't. There's this wonderful concept called the opsimath, which means you learn. It's lifelong learning, and that's what we've done in our group, and it's really fascinating. And I think one of the messages that's come over from the presentations that I hope you get is that this is not a dry, static, dusty subject, of course, because there are so many dynamic factors. There's the dynamics of the natural environment. There's the dynamics of the human-natural interaction at global scale all the way down to site scale and how we grapple with that. I don't notice any particular questions there, but we do have with us also our good friend who keeps us all in order, who is the secretary of the Geoheritage Specialist Group, Dr. Wesley Hill. And she had to get up very early in the morning as well. I mean, it's amazing, actually, looking at the participant list. We have people from as far east as China who must be propping their eyelids up, and those that are just drinking their strong coffee to get them awake in the morning. So Wesley, just tell the participants a little bit about the Geoheritage Specialist Group. There's also people have been asking, well, how do you join? And in particular, Sam Granger has put a question in the Q&A box. How do you facilitate a membership application when you don't know anybody in the system? So good to see you, and
thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Roger, is it okay if I share my screen?
By all means, yes.
By all means, yes.
Okay, wonderful. All right, good morning and good evening, everyone. I'm Wesley Hill. I am the secretary for the Geoheritage Specialist Group within IUCN, within the World Commission on Protected Areas. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of information on where the Geoheritage Specialist Group is nestled and nested within IUCN and within the World Commission on Protected Areas. So IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. They are a global union that deals with a lot of global entities such as UNESCO. It's the IUCN is very famous for its work with World Heritage, with the natural sites with UNESCO. And the Union on the Conservation of Nature. And the World Commission on Protected Areas is just one of the commissions within IUCN. So there are 6 commissions under IUCN, and such commissions, you can see kind of the importance and the type of work that IUCN takes forward with its commissions. They have the Commission on Education and Communication. There's the IUCN Commission, the Species Survival Commission. There's the World Commission on Environmental Law, the Commission on Ecosystem Management, the World Commission on Environmental, Economic, and Social Policy. And then there's the World Commission on Protected Areas. And so this is the specific commission that IUCN works with in order to forward its work in protected areas, parks, World Heritage Sites, etc. So within each of those 6 commissions, there lies specialist groups. And these are the groups of experts, of scientists. In our case, our group is comprised of scientists, educators, and protected area managers, but everyone within our group deals with protected areas in some form or another, if it's in the scientific realm, the education realm, or working directly on the ground with protected areas in general. So we have specialist groups, and this is where the IUCN commissions rely to get their work done. They rely on these group of experts to get a lot of their work done within the scientific realm and such. One of our goals within the geoheritage specialist group was to publish the best practices for geoconservation within protected areas. So you'll see that we have a charge within IUCN and within the World Commission on Protected Areas to give expert advice within certain areas of expertise, and where IUCN can come and ask of our group certain questions or certain areas for us to work within. So within the Geoheritage Specialist Group within the WCPA, we work under a mission. Such mission statements are to provide advice and guidance for aspects of geodiversity as it relates to the establishment and effective management of protected areas. This is one of the areas of work that we work in within IUCN. Also to provide advice on conservation and management of geoheritage within protected areas and prepare guidance material. And so under that particular goal, this is where we produce the best practices on geoconservation, was under that specific goal within our terms of reference with the WCPA. We also to provide specialist advice as necessary to support assessment of World Heritage Sites nominated by the IUCN World Heritage Panel. So IUCN and WCPA may reach out to our group of experts in order to give expert advice within World Heritage Sites that are nominated under criteria 8, which is the Earth Sciences criteria for OUV within World Heritage nominations. We also support the integration of geodiversity into relevant IUCN programs and activities. So these are the type of work that we do within our charge. We do have a very specific charge and our terms of reference within the WCPA. And this is the type of activities that we're involved in under the IUCN umbrella. On this point, I don't have the fancy PowerPoint that my other colleagues have shown. So I'm just having the web page for you here. And I will be sending out in the chat to all the participants the links to this page for you to bookmark for future reference. So we saw in the one of the questions in the chat box is, how do you get involved with IUCN? How do you get involved with the World Commission on Protected Areas? And how do you get involved with the Geoheritage Specialist Group? As these are the 3 layers that tick down. First, the first process is to join as a general member of the World Commission on Protected Areas, to join as a general member of the WCPA. To do that for our specific commission, you would need to work with protected areas in some way. So if you're a scientist, if you're an educator, if you're in the geoheritage realm, then you would apply to be a member of the WCPA. To do that, we can send you a letter of invitation. And then from that letter of invitation, you can upload that to the application system for WCPA. And then you can join within the WCPA, you can join various specialist groups. There's a World Heritage Specialist Group, there's a Geoheritage Specialist Group, so you can join our group from there. In the chat box in a few minutes, I will post my email address, and you can send me your name and email address, and I can send you a letter of invitation to join our group. I will also put other very important links that the GSG, the Geoheritage Group, is involved in right now. We're involved with the World Conservation Congress that's coming up in Marseille in September. I'll send you a link to that. We're involved with the ProGeo conference that's coming up in Spain in June, and I'll send you a link to that as well in the chat box. I will also send a link to the resolution, the IUCN Geoheritage resolution that has just been passed. So there are very good advantages of being involved with our group, because like with the resolution with IUCN for Geoheritage, now this is an umbrella global theme that you can anchor your work to. So if IUCN has a resolution in geoheritage and geoconservation, you can anchor your work under that IUCN resolution and refer back to that resolution, showing that IUCN is promoting protection of geological heritage within protected areas. So, you know, there's various ways to use the IUCN charge and what they're doing globally for protection. So I will send you the link to all of these things in the chat group. And again, if you send me your name and email address, then I'm happy to send you a letter of invitation to join our group. So I hope in summary that gives you a little bit more information about where the Geoheritage Specialist Group is nestled within the larger IUCN and then nestled within the World Commission on Protected Areas, and how we carry our work forward on this global platform.
Wesley, thank you very much indeed. And I hope that answers the specific question that Sam Granger asked, and also for others who would like to join in our endeavors. I would say that we're not, although it's called a specialist group, we are looking for specialists, and we have plenty of them, and you've heard from some of them today, but we're also keen to have those of us like myself who've been involved much more in the policy and overall management side, or like Dan in the communication side as well. So we want to have a broad basis. It's not a matter of, you know, having 3 degrees in the earth scientist to be a member, because as I think Peter Mills said in one of his comments, geodiversity is the foundation of biodiversity, but we often forget it. And in a sense, our mission in this group is to make sure that that message isn't forgotten, and that we help other colleagues who are working in protected areas or in broader policy to factor this in, so that we take that more integrated and more holistic view of nature when we're dealing with the real world in our day-to-day jobs. Now, I don't see any other questions in the Q&A or the chat. But I would like to just ask my colleagues on the panel, is there any point of reflection that you would like to make before we conclude?
You know, I've been struck over the last couple of weeks that we seem to be in a period where many governments are recognizing the need to increase the amount of protected areas. You know, one example is that in the United States, President Biden committed the United States to having 30% of our area set aside as a protected area. And, you know, I think it's always exciting to be in this field, but I think now is a time where there could be a real growth in the amount of protected areas. And so I think it's timely that we have some good guidance available. And I'm really happy to have so many participants at the launch event of this too. I think these kinds of goals are going to take a lot of work to really make them happen. And so glad to have more people in the ranks. Yeah.
John, you're...
If I can just add that, as Jose pointed out, I think the recent IUCN resolution provides an important platform for developing our work. And I think it gives us a lot of encouragement to engage with governments and other agencies to promote geoconservation and to take forward our work in this area. So I think it is a big step forwards.
Thank you. I notice that Tim Badman is participating. Tim is, if you like, our mentor and guide within the IUCN Secretariat. You want to say anything, Tim? I'm not putting you on the spot if you don't.
Hi, Roger. Sorry, I wasn't expecting that. I was glad I was listening. No, I mean, not much to say. Sorry, I'm actually, I was just getting to the point where I had to pick up the kids. So I'm actually out on the football pitch with the kids. But I mean, firstly, just to say thanks to everybody, because I think it's really a great achievement to bring together so much that focuses on geoheritage, but connect it to the big mission that protected areas are trying to engage in. And I think it's also great to remember that protected areas themselves have this very broad view of nature. So geodiversity is a sort of crucial element of that, but to really focus on what that means in practice in protected areas is important. I think it's also great to I guess my reflection is listening to Dan is just how we can't understand places that we're managing unless we can really tell the big story and the full story since they began. I'm actually out here in a protected area in Switzerland. I can turn around and you can see the mountains of the Gruyere behind me. You just can't understand this place unless you can really understand the rocks beneath your feet and how everything that's happened here has those deep roots. I'd like to just echo the thanks, Roger, that you gave at the start to the Cultural Heritage Administration of the Republic of Korea, who've not only supported this initiative but have supported two other products focused on geodiversity, one being the update of our thematic approach to recognizing volcanoes and volcanic landscapes on the World Heritage List. And I think Tom Casadevall is also on the call, one of the lead authors there, and Dan was one of the lead authors of that publication. So great to great that that's been achieved, and we're also now in the last stages of finalizing a complete update of the thematic framework for geological World Heritage. So these are all efforts that wouldn't have happened without the support of the Cultural Heritage Administration of Korea. So I think just to really echo thanks there. No, I think just in conclusion, great to see the launch today. Really, delighted this has all come together, and I think it's really important that the the geoheritage specialist group gives us a way to focus on how we can carry forward these, really now quite significant mandates in IUCN focused on geodiversity and geoheritage, but we really need to now act on, including the resolution that's been mentioned, which adds to several other resolutions since Barcelona in 2008 that have brought geodiversity into IUCN's work. So I wasn't expecting to be put on the spot, but a few reflections, and let me just say again thanks to everybody for making this happen, and also for the event today, and thanks to our good friends and colleagues in the Global Protected Areas program in IUCN as well, who've been running this brilliant Vital Sites series, and thanks for making space for geodiversity and geoheritage in that as well. Hope that addresses your question, Roger, and thanks.
Very good.
Thanks,
very good.
thanks
Yes.
for the opportunity.
Yeah, very good. You've got the job, Tim. Well done. Yes. Thank you for accepting that impromptu. That's very helpful indeed. And all the best with the football game as well.
Roger, I have
add something. Yeah.
One last comment. This last week, the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, released its huge global report on climate change called Making Peace with Nature. And it's getting a lot of press. There's a lot of governments that are coming on board, and climate change is the big topic. So anything that we can do within our group and that the participants can do within their work within protected areas and geoheritage, geodiversity, geoconservation, and link it back in to climate change. And specifically this UNEP, this UNEP report, Making Peace with Nature, it's another good anchor point going back to this report that governments are using to do funding and priorities to really show the sustainability work that they're doing within climate change. So I just wanted to add that. I did put the link to the report in the chat box. I also did put the link to the volcanoes report that Tim had mentioned in the chat box as well.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much. Well, it's interesting. I was trained as a geographer and taught that everything was connected, and and then we put everything in silos for the next 40, 50 years. And what recent times have shown for us, without any doubt whatsoever, in terms of scientific endeavor, in terms of public interest, in terms of having a future for people and nature on our crowded planet, is that everything is connected, and that unless we bring all the elements together. So, one of our missions, as should be clear to all of you listening to us, it is, of course, about communicating this message of connectedness and the importance of the interactions, whether it be within nature itself or that very important interaction with people, all the way from the site level to the global system scales. And I'm sure most of you who have been living through these really dreadful times in the last year have, like me, I can look out at the window and see the river running by, and been so helped by access to nature. Not everybody has it there, but we can, as Dan said, access it virtually so well these days also. And it's that vital connection. We say people and nature. I think many of us, and I'm certainly one of those who feel that people are part of nature. We have been part of it ever since we came on this earth. Unfortunately, as we moved into what geologists are beginning to call the Anthropocene, we have tried to overwhelm it. And what we're now trying to do is to get that balance back. Anyway, enough of that sermon. I hope that you found this snapshot of our work generally and the contents of the guidelines of help. please come back to us. You can see the contact list at the beginning of the guidelines, and I repeat, it's there on the IUCN website, just and the link is given to you in the chat box there. My email number is there if you want to take up any particular points. Obviously, if you want to join, please take up with Wesley and show you how to get it, because the more of us, the better. Thank you so much for joining us from right across the world. We timed this, that we know it can't suit everybody in this global time span, but the fact that we've had people from China in the Far East to the west coast of the USA is wonderful. And I hope you have found it valuable, whether you're in Kenya or Nigeria or Portugal or Croatia, or wherever else you have been listening. Please use the guideline. And if you've got some best practice or not so good practice that you'd like to share with us, well, please share it with us, because it's our ambition to collect a dossier of practice over time. Our guideline is, to me, a disappointment in that it doesn't have as much of a global feel in terms of examples as I'd have hoped. But we kept asking and we didn't get any more information, but we're very pleased to receive it, and we'll work out then how to share it around the globe in our network. So thank you all very much indeed. Please keep safe and well, and of course, keep active for conservation in its many and varied guises.